right, we're just about ready to get started here in about a minute. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Okay, so welcome everybody to our current installment of our anti-racism series. Today we will be discussing schools, prisons, and the connection between the two. We have a nice lineup of a combination of both arts and education because the two go hand in hand. So we've got some pieces by Alyesha Wise, Art Quiros, and Taylor Code, as well as a presentation from Dr. Matthew Clair, who is a professor of sociology at Stanford, as well as a presentation from our own Dr. Ayesha Khan. So I'm excited. I hope everyone here is excited. We're going to learn a lot. But before we get into the heavy duty learning, let's have some more artistic learning. We'll have a poem by Alyesha as well as one by Art. So welcome everyone. Let's get after it. So first up, I think we have Alyesha.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I just want to get right into the poem. I appreciate you having us. I was told that I should diversify my writing, but I believe that is code for let them see your teeth. What if I snarl instead of smile? What if I am more angry for trying not to be? About 5 years ago, my brother went missing, and by missing, I mean his spirit was no longer here. You know what I mean, Black folk? By the way, I only write my Black poems for Black folk. You know what I mean when I say he went missing. A friend asked, why don't y'all just go get him? And that's why I need these spaces to not commit crimes. There are some things they just don't get, like how my Blackest poem has kept me out of prison, like how some of us choose to run away in our art so we won't run away from our spirits. I mean, what is the bigger concern here? Me not erasing the N-word in my writing or offending those who choose to erase the, what about those poems or those other poems where I spoke about Prince or coming out, or when I wrote about the pain between my legs? What color was I then? Did I move too fast? Was my back hunched? Did I look like I was about to leap? I am their favorite thing to watch on mute. I am a church of God, aware that my strength is in my song. I am a slave spread open on a laboratory table, a white gaze questioning the extent of my pain. I am a loud woman because I've known silence, how it has entered me, forced its way onto my tongue, became my narrative I have never authored. I know how it can bleach a map, so I am writing my way home. I know how it readies my fist, makes them heavy and justified.
Wow. I don't want to interrupt that power. So let's keep it going and have our second piece, and then we'll take a moment to unpack some of this.
But first, thank you so much, Alyesha, for that wonderful, wonderful poem. I'd like to properly introduce you and the Street Poets. The Street Poets are a nonprofit, poetry-based peacemaking organization dedicated to the creative process as a force for individual and community transformation. Born from a poetry workshop in the LA County Juvenile Probation Camp, Street Poets have evolved into a multidimensional arts education organization that harnesses the healing power of poetry, music, and ritual to save lives. Street Poets outreach has extended from prison cells to public school classrooms, from inner city projects to Indian reservations, from LA street corners to countries like Belize, Sweden, Northern Ireland, Finland, Kenya, and South Africa. Street Poets breaks the cycle of violence in the lives of at-risk and incarcerated youth, awakening them to their gifts. So thank you, Alyesha. That was very wonderful and powerful. May I ask if Art, our other street poet, is on, or if he can come back at a later time?
I'm trying to get him on. He's having trouble with the link, but I think we can have Taylor go if that's okay. And then we can have Dr. Clair go, I think.
Okay. Let me introduce Taylor. So Taylor Code Maxey Jr. is an author and poet. He's led hundreds of writing workshops in LA County classrooms, juvenile detention centers, and probation camps. He uses music, poetry, and rites of passage work to promote healing, education, and restorative justice in the lives of incarcerated and highly at-risk youth and young adults. So take it away, Taylor. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I got so much rage in the bank, I'm living large off the interest. An investment trust account, reaping the perks of big business. But before I self-destruct and let the wealth tear me apart, let me splurge for a minute and get this burden off my heart. I don't know how to start because it's dark and runs deep. Back to that demon I first saw when my parents were both asleep. I swear it only seems like it was just yesterday when Pops threw Mama in the tub with blood gushing from her face. That was a quarter century ago, but I'm still hearing screams. In my cell yelling no because they echo in my dreams. Mama took me off to Texas when the dope took you under, and it was there I got molested and my sunshine turned to thunder. Reflecting on these troubles, sometimes my tears become laughs because you had the nerve to wonder why I chose to walk a dark path. My last hope was the streets, so I banged the local gang, but that even took something I could never again claim. Can the Lord blame me for all the sins I've committed or close the pearly gates because I lacked the wisdom to do different? I wanted the world to feel the kind of pain I was feeling, so I robbed and pistol whipped the man in front of his own children. And to make matters worse, homie showed me love for that, celebrating all the hate that I now wish I could take back. Was it the Haldol and Cogentin that ran through mama's veins, mixed with the dope and daddy seed that made me grow to be insane? When I felt the urge to change, my enemies cast me out with slugs and left me leaking in the street, talking to God about peace. My scars tell a story that only pauses for effect as I choke off the gun smoke, praying to take another breath. I'd be lying if I said I never cried in my cell, because I'm forced to face the truth, walking the main line in jail. It's hell to be alone and prevail against these thoughts, but I'm thankful for the chance, because I was way too lost. I didn't know how good it felt to smile till I was on the verge of death, with 30 staples in my stomach and half a dozen in my neck. It's obvious that I'm blessed because I can still draw some breath, but it's also clear that I'm cursed to carry the burden of such stress. If I had to formulate the words to explain the world to my daughters, it'd probably take some Hail Marys and a fifth of holy water. Am I wrong for wanting to tell them these ugly facts we tend to hide? Or should I keep my mouth shut and hope they find a way to rise? I treasure times like this when the truth invades my spirit. But the sad thing is, not too many want to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. That was very moving. Before we get back to Art, who has now joined us, I'd like to talk about the MSCA, the organizers and hosts of this event. I'd like to first off thank the many, many students who are part of this coalition and our faculty allies, and our students who have put so much work into this series, and the various BCM and UT Health organizations that have helped sponsor this event, especially Graduate Student Council for sponsoring us a lot for this event. So this event was made possible by students and trainees who founded the Medical and Science Coalition for Activism, an organization whose mission is to advocate for marginalized groups and make our community more socially just, diverse, inclusive, and equitable. So be sure to follow MSCA on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and visit our Linktree site to find out how to get involved. And that information can be found in the chat feature. And so please note that this is all going to be recorded and archived, and you could submit questions at any time using the Q&A function of the Zoom at any time during the talks. And so we'll have members of our team monitoring these questions where we will ask them in a moderated Q&A after presentations. Thank you, Taylor, and if Art Quiros could now join us and share his poem.
Hello, everybody. My name is Quiros. I apologize for being late. I was just running a workshop with some young people through a music program. Thank you for having me. I grew up in a culture infatuated with violence. We was trying to speak out through the wounds and the silence. Some trauma's timeless, spending a lifetime just trying to find excuses for this pain that we be hiding. Panic, anxiety, why society lying, trying to paint this picture of a truth, things I really seen. Broken dreams, dealers becoming fiends, and daughters is losing fathers for the age of. They talking G's, money, it speaks to me, but how you put a price between your freedom and your family. Ain't nothing gangster about getting caught in an ambush. They plotting to take your rights, you giving in to their entrapment. When I was captive, praying on second chances, spending so much time waiting on God to give me answers. I scribbled transcripts, got keys from my ancestors, processing this grief that bothered me. But what it really mean? It bothered me, followed me to reality. It's sad to see homelessness in a body. We are alive, but what we do to survive may be so unreal we can't be real with each other. Recollect depth, death, and depth. Grew up with less, but blessed to have another breath. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. That was awesome. Next, we'll be moving on to Dr. Clair. Dr. Clair is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and the Law School at Stanford University. His research interests include law and society, I'm so sorry, race and ethnicity, cultural sociology, criminal justice, and qualitative methods. His book, Privilege and Punishment, How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court, shows how race and class inequalities in the criminal legal system are embedded in and reproduced through attorney-client relationship. Matt's research has been extensively published and has contributed to policy reports on reducing racialized mass incarceration and improving the health of racial and ethnic minorities. So take it away, Dr. Clair.
Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. And thanks again to Dr. Khan for inviting me, as well as the Medical and Science Coalition for Activism. You all are doing really important work. So thank you for organizing this 5-part anti-racism teach-in series and committing to this long-term endeavor at the Texas Medical Center. And in this moment of crisis, and what I think also is a huge moment for potential change, unlike many that we've seen before. I also want to just acknowledge the poets and artists who came just preceded me. Truly powerful and important words that I think often gets lost in the social scientific conversation, honestly. So I really appreciate the value and the experiences that you all add. So over the past several months, our country has been consumed by the uncertainty of a pandemic, massive unemployment, and of course, continuous protests against racist police violence and other forms of violence perpetuated by the criminal legal system. And so my talk today, which I've titled Mass Criminalization, Health and Racial Injustice, will draw on social scientific evidence to examine how these problems are interrelated. And I'll focus in particular on the role of mass incarceration and what I refer to as mass criminalization, and fundamentally shaping the way that race is understood in our society, and that the way that racism functions as a form of social control and exploitation. So before I begin, I sort of want to take sort of a page from the poets and acknowledge the specific people and experiences and tragedies that were lost this spring and summer, who have been sort of the catalyst for what brought about this workshop in many ways, and workshops that are happening across the country, and also renewed calls for racial justice. So I'm talking, of course, about the state-sanctioned killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Rayshard Brooks, and so many other Black people and other people of color who have been killed at the hands of police or at the hands of white civilians who have felt emboldened to kill Black people, given the law and our current government's seeming disregard for Black lives. In addition to these recent deaths, there are also the countless Christian Coopers of the world, people whose lives were almost taken and are continually threatened, given our society's tight association between Blackness and alleged criminality, and given everyday understandings, even among seemingly progressive and well-intentioned people, white people in particular, of the way that our criminal legal system functions as a form of racial social control. But of course, these functions and killings are not new. In 2014, there was Michael Brown and Ferguson. In 2012, when I was entering graduate school and deciding what I was going to do my research on, I knew I wanted to study racial inequality, but I came to want to study how the law reproduces racial inequality because of the killing of Trayvon Martin in Florida. In the 90s, there was Amadou Diallo and Rodney King. In 1964, there was James Powell. In 1955, of course, there was Emmett Till. So these names are the ones we know, but they are just a small fraction of the harms caused by our criminal legal system and what scholars and activists such as Angela Y. Davis, Dylan Rodriguez, and others have referred to as the prison industrial complex. So the criminal legal system has a long history of racism, from Black codes, convict leasing, slave patrols that were the antecedents to police in the South, to the history of felony disenfranchisement, which emerged explicitly from as an intentional way to suppress Black men's right to vote through laws that targeted Black people and constructed conceptions of crime and criminality. But we see now sort of a symptom of what really started to emerge and occur and rise up in the 1980s. That was an important turning point, given that in the 1980s, there was a documented massive increase in the scale of the legal system in poor communities of color. So the 1980s is the start of what I refer to as the period of mass criminalization. So we often speak of the term mass incarceration. You've undoubtedly heard that term many times. And this term characterizes the massive and historically unprecedented use of prisons and jails to punish people convicted of crimes, and also to warehouse people pre-trial who are accused of crime or other legal violations. In 2008, for instance, incarceration rates peaked at 2.3 million people behind bars in jails, prisons, or immigrant detention centers. But I argue that over this same period, the legal system expanded beyond the prison. Federal, state, and local governments shifted financial resources into courts, probation, police. The growing number of public police officers far outpaced the population increase over this period. Private companies, universities that many of us work at, and other organizations hired their own private police forces. Over a few decades, the number of people controlled by criminal legal institutions spiked almost mechanically. So today, more than 1 million people are probation or parole, and more than 50 million people have some form of interaction or contact with police in any given year. Thus, instead of mass incarceration, I engage with the work of lawyer and activist Deborah Small to argue that we can speak of our society experiencing a crisis that is better described as one of mass criminalization. So in my book, Privilege and Punishment, How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court, I define mass criminalization as the historically unprecedented expansion of the techniques and systems of punitive legal control in numerous institutions in our society. And this is an expansion that has impacted a broad swath of people. So even as it has targeted poor communities of color, it has become so large that it has pulled in other people who historically have not been the targets of criminalization. Still, mass criminalization is undoubtedly racialized and classed, mostly to the detriment of poor Black, Latinx, and American Indian people. So much so that involvement with the criminal law has become normalized in many communities, meaning it's more common than a college degree or an occupation or a stable job. So in most jurisdictions across the country, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans are more likely than white people to be stopped by the police, killed in an officer-involved shooting, arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a period of incarceration. In 2005, the national incarceration rate for white people was 412 for every 100,000 residents. And that's compared to 2,290 for Black people and 742 for Hispanics. These figures mean that 2.3% of all Black people were incarcerated, compared to 0.4% of white people and 0.7% of Hispanic people. And mass incarceration and criminalization are targeted at young Black people in particular. This is where the disparities are starkest. So in 2014, Black and Hispanic men aged 18 to 19 years old were respectively 10 and 3 times more likely to be imprisoned than white men of the same age. And among women, the imprisonment rate for African American women was twice the rate of the imprisonment rate for white women. And the rate of Hispanic women was 1.3 times the rate of white women. So I've been thinking a lot recently, as many people have, about the interrelationship of mass criminalization and the pandemic. And I think we should understand the COVID-19 pandemic and its unequal burden on Black, Indigenous, and Latinx communities as in part a system of broader legal realities that have been harming marginalized communities for decades. Basically, this could have been predicted. So in short, the rise of mass criminalization and our society's investment in police and prisons has contributed to the co-occurring public health crisis that is only growing worse with each passing day in the United States. So my colleague, Asad El-Assad, and I have written an article in a journal called Social Science and Medicine in 2018, where we argue and theorize how the law creates what we term racialized legal statuses that directly impact public health. So racialized legal statuses, as we define them, are discredited social positions in relation to a society's rights and obligations as codified by the prevailing system of laws and techniques that govern groups, behaviors, and other criminalized behaviors. So these statuses negatively and disproportionately impact marginalized racial and ethnic minorities. And we spotlight and focus specifically on 2 types of statuses, criminalized statuses and then immigration statuses, which are both codified by the law. So statuses such as being an ex-felon or an undocumented immigrant restrict social and political rights. So for example, many of the formerly incarcerated lack the right to vote. Many undocumented immigrants lack access to public assistance. And these statuses also not only restrict just sort of the social and material resources that we know are determinants of health, but they also stigmatize racial minorities who are legally unmarked by the status, but are nevertheless assumed to hold the status, sort of through a form of what economists refer to as statistical discrimination. So for example, when Black job applicants who do not have a criminal record are nonetheless assumed to have a criminal record because of the tight link between race, especially Blackness, and alleged criminality. Or when Latino US citizens might be driving and they might be stopped by police or surveilled by police under the assumption that because of the way they look, they're undocumented. And so these legal statuses and the legal control mechanisms that these statuses entail, as well as sort of the way that they characterize racial groups and the mechanisms of apprehension, detention, and surveillance, we argue have negative health consequences. So we look at research across the social sciences and public health, criminology, and sociology that shows different ways that racialized legal statuses operate as a fundamental social determinant of health. So for example, researchers have found that men's incarceration increases HIV and AIDS infection rates among women partners, as well as infant mortality rates among their children. The work of Abigail Sewell has found that aggressive policing of neighborhoods has been associated with psychological distress, even among neighborhood residents who have no direct contact with police. So these are people who just live there and have vicariously experienced the police harassment of their neighbors. Police-civilian interactions gone wrong are a leading cause of death among young men of color. More than 1,000 people are killed by police every year in the US. And research by Frank Edwards, Hedwig Lee, and Michael Esposito estimates that Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white men. And the collective mourning among Black people who witness police violence vicariously, whether in person or even via social media, has been linked to depressive symptomatology and anxiety. Incarceration also has been shown to have mostly negative health effects in the work of countless scholars like Michael Masoglia, Christopher Wildeman, Jason Schnitker, and Sarah Wakefield. And some studies actually in this area suggest that incarceration might improve mortality rates among some minority groups because our society does such a bad job providing resources and access to health and insurance, given our sort of attachment between employment and health insurance, to people outside of carceral facilities, such that when they go into carceral facilities, they actually have access to sometimes more health resources. But even though mortality rates might improve for some people who are incarcerated, morbidity rates and exposure to infectious diseases are higher among the incarcerated. And incarceration is also associated with stress and depression. And for those leaving prison, the mark of a criminal record reduces their chance of employment and integration into other health promoting institutions, such as post-secondary education and their families. And in this current pandemic, we have seen racialized legal statuses operating to produce racial disparities in contracting and dying, of course, from our most recent infectious disease, COVID-19. So available CDC data suggests that for people in the 45 through 54 age group, Black and Latinx death rates are at least 6 times higher than they are for white people. And high rates of coronavirus cases are clustering in communities and spaces that have specifically been targeted by punitive legal control because they've fostered unhealthy conditions, inability to access resources, and the risks of hazardous working conditions. And then, of course, we can think of prisons or carceral spaces as a prime example of the way that racialized legal status has affected the likelihood of contracting COVID-19. So sociologist John Eason has analyzed COVID-19 cases from March 1st through April 5th across US counties. And his analysis showed that counties with prisons were also counties that were hotspots for the initial outbreak. And historically, we know that prisons are often hotspots for outbreaks such as tuberculosis that then spread into the outside community. And of course, because incarcerated people are more likely to be Black and Latinx, therefore it has an undue burden in these communities. And not only is there a spread between or from people who are incarcerated and then returning back to their communities, but also John Eason talks about a spread that's potential between people who are correctional officers and their family and friends. And the irony here is that often correctional officers are actually disproportionately Black and Latinx. And so some of the same sort of scaffolding and architecture that we've relied on to marginalize and penalize and criminalize Black and Latinx people, unfortunately, the irony is that also some jobs have arisen through mass criminalization that have afforded Black people and Latinx people a sustainable way of living. Early data on infection rates in jails are also troubling. The Marshall Project has been tracking confirmed cases in prison since March. So as of early July, when I last checked, 57,019 incarcerated people had tested positive and 651 had died. And you can go on the Marshall Project right now, and I'm sure it's updated, and you can see how the cost has increased even more. A recent study was just published also that found that the death rate among incarcerated people is about 3 times higher than the death rate in the general population. And then outside prison walls, the notion of racialized legal status also helps us theorize how the state's punitive logics have made Black and Latino communities generally more susceptible to COVID-19. So people with criminal records having trouble finding housing, which obviously is crucial for us to be able to physically distance. People with criminal records are also discriminated against in the labor market and then are sort of slotted and segregated into jobs that require them to interface more with people or have to leave their home. And because health insurance is typically tied to employment, people who are unemployed or precariously employed have trouble accessing healthcare to prevent and treat any symptoms they may have. And this is, of course, magnified by the fact that on the sort of national level, the unemployment rate is now hovering, I think the last time I checked, around 15%. And our politicians and political class, of course, just keep struggling to figure out what to do or just completely have no interest in mitigating the negative impacts of our unsustainable capitalist economic system. And all of these social realities add up to a situation, of course, of profound racial injustice. And these injustices are not new, but the pandemic has brought to the fore issues that have been festering for years and have also more clearly revealed their intersections in a way that it has not been revealed so starkly before. And so as much as this is a profound moment of crisis and injustice, I also think it's a moment for potential seismic reimagining of our legal system, largely thanks to the work of organizers and activists in the movement for Black Lives, who've consistently advocated for policies against mass criminalization, have expanded our way of thinking about abolition and abolitionist politics. That will most likely improve our collective well-being, and that certainly will be better than what we're doing right now. And so I think that social scientists, physicians, and public health officials would do well to follow the lead of organizers first and foremost. So thanks so much for allowing me to present, and I look forward to seeing the rest of the teach-in and answering any questions in the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Clair. That was very insightful, excuse me. So reminder, if anyone has any questions for any of our speakers tonight, please submit them through the Q&A. Up next, we'll have Taylor present another poem.
Hello?
Yes, got you.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
How can the son of a lost tribe ever find his way home when the world sells him lies and he fears the unknown? He's righteous down to the bone, but condemned to bad seed, the pain of a broken soul broadcast in 3D. They want to exile and execute us all like Troy Davis. Pray to the spirits for the miracles that can save us. Haters, hate it because I spit it so raw. I make a clown in a suit, rebuke the roots of his paw. Saw demons in my dreams, so I slept with the burner. Woke up in county jail, conspiracy to a murder. Daughter crying heavy tears, asking mom for her dad, while the DA screams, I want the chair for his ass. The lash at me in vain is as useless as a cobra with no venom in his fangs. Bring the pain like Cosa Nostra. If I was accused of crimes against humanity like Arabs and Israelites, would you condemn me as a villain because I ain't perfect like Christ? Break the ice and sacrifice the reservations you may hold and postpone a verdict till the story's been told. Some of us walk a dark path before we touch by the light, like it was written in the Chronicles since the first breath of life. So who are you to pass judgment and outcast me from society when I'm just sticking to the script that the universe provided me? I was blinded by the shine of a princess cut diamond, so forgive me if I ain't manifest remorse for being grimy. But the cloth from which I'm cut don't come from exotic places. I was just a renegade in pursuit of big faces. Was once enthralled by a dream, surrounded by picket fences, till my windows all exploded and shattered that shadow vision. So when I perish, cherish these words like a eulogy, because when I'm finally dead and gone, what can these devils do to me? Lock my demons in a casket with 2 pounds of sage and send them up the river to the lady at the lake, so she can wash the dirt away from the portal of my wounds, and I see past the pain enough for the gift to come through. The fact that I'm eligible for forgiveness is a miracle. I gave guns to boys that drive my enemies hysterical. Unbearable as it is, my reflection in the mirror with a face full of tears makes the picture seem clearer. Beneath the surface of the scars is the me I yearn to be. But that dude thugging hard was the me I learned to be. I sent the man in the bank with instructions to get the dough, but it turned out to be the dude's suicide note. And even though my wife left me kicking rocks on the yard, the spirit still blessed me with the breath to go hard. To sum it up with one line, one time for the youth, little homie, slow it down, because this me could be you. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next presentation will be from Dr. Ayesha Khan. She is a grassroots activist, educator, and infectious disease specialist scientist and clinical microbiologist at University of Texas Health. She works on bridging science and social justice. Dr. Khan received her PhD from UTA Health recently and received her bachelor's in microbiology, global studies, and public policy from the University of California, Los Angeles. She served as a board member of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and served as the director of the Incarcerated Youth Tutorial Project at UCLA. She has 10 years of advocacy experience, primarily focusing on racial justice in science and medicine, educational equity for marginalized Black and Brown youth, immigrant rights, and advocacy for Muslims and other minorities in South Asia. Dr. Khan, please take it away.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, everyone, again, for being here. And I want to thank Dr. Clair for actually perfectly summarizing a lot of the background and setting the stage for this event. And for the Street Poets, I've actually, for folks that might not know, I've worked with the Street Poets before in Los Angeles. We collectively worked on a lot of events and a lot of initiatives to raise awareness about incarcerated youth and exactly what they go through. So thank you again, Taylor and Art, for finding your way all the way here to Houston. And Alyesha, again, it was incredible hearing you and meeting you as well. Like Malcolm said, I work at the intersection of a lot of different social justice issues, and I want to dive into that. But before I start, going off of what Dr. Clair said, I want to talk about our role as scientists and healthcare professionals. We often look at racism as an external problem and kind of contextualize it as if it's we as a science and medical community are immune to it, when in fact our fields are inherently perpetuating and actively upholding many racist practices that is harming our Black and Brown patients. So again, to set the space, you know, America's combating a pandemic and a 400-year-old endemic, which is systemic racism that has killed a lot more Black and Brown people. And I think to understand how we need to reframe what we do is really important because, like Dr. Clair said, COVID-19 just exacerbated pre-existing social inequities and just exposed the racism in science and medicine, actually, that kills marginalized communities. We know infectious diseases do burden Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color the most. And this is in America, but also in countries that in the aftermath of colonialism are now called developing. But the problem is when we're talking about racial disparities, a lot of times we attribute higher morbidity and mortality to higher rates of comorbidities, right? And that includes diabetes and hypertension. And all of those are valid statistically, but we do that without any mention of the root cause, which is systemic racism. And that raises serious problems because, again, America was a nation built, is a settler colonial nation built on the genocide of Indigenous people and expanded via the capitalistic exploitation and enslavement of Black people. So inherently, racism is a structural system of injustice that has over time led to bad health. And COVID-19, just like how we recognize that that's a big problem, racism is also a public health crisis. And just like COVID-19, racism also does kill. And a lot of the work that we do is still rooted in justification of a lot of these racist ideas, which is based on flawed historical and modern research that claims intrinsic biological differences between the races, when in fact, that's not true and not accurate and largely used to perpetuate mistreatment and mismanagement of Black patients. Again, I hope that we can move forward and keep in mind when we're talking about our medical issues and when we're talking about science as well, that if we do ever mention racial disparities, that we contextualize it and talk about how infection mortality rates are always higher for Black and Brown people because they are more exposed because of social inequity, and they face a greater burden of chronic diseases, which also are a manifestation of systemic racism. And that is poverty, systemic discrimination, police violence, exposure to toxic pollutants in air and water, and unemployment, and as we're going to talk about, mass incarceration. And I think it's really, really fundamental that we kind of begin to do that. And with that, I'm going to actually start sharing my screen so we can get into some of the statistics. All right. Okay. I can't see the chat, but just let me know. Any of the panelists can let me know if they can't see the screen. So I think Dr. Clair mentioned some really important points about contextualizing history and how that's so fundamental to us understanding why mass incarceration is the way it is in America today. And I will be talking about that before I dive into what I'm here to talk about, which is the school to prison pipeline. So a lot of the work that I'm talking about is going to be coming at the heels of the direct interaction that I've had with incredible kids who had a lot of their life taken away and a lot of opportunities deprived from them because of incarceration. And that's exactly what the school to prison pipeline is, a prioritization of punishment and incarceration over education, and the funneling of kids of color from schools into the criminal justice system, which deprives them of opportunities over time. And the work that I did in Los Angeles, and again, this was the beginning of a lot of my activism, was in LA County. And these are some of the camps that we went to, and we tutored and mentored some of these young men of color. And what you will see is the school to prison pipeline is a perfect amalgamation of the horrible injustices that exist in our society and are systemic, which is mass incarceration, police brutality, prison industrial complex, and educational inequity. So we're just gonna have to tie all that in together. And before I get into that, we talk about slavery as if it's a thing of the past. And I want us to constantly recognize that slavery is still here and it's still active, and this is codified into law. The 13th Amendment does explicitly have in it a legalization of where slavery is okay. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. And I think that's important because it's been used to create a lot of the structural injustices we're talking about. As Dr. Clair mentioned, America incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. We have 5% of the world's population, but a quarter of the world's prisoners. And the rationale behind incarceration gets confusing because despite overall crime rates that have dropped dramatically over the past few years, we have constantly been incarcerating more and more people, which should get us to think, why is that happening? There's over 2.4 million people in prisons and jails today, and it's important to understand that a lot of this is not about public safety. And of course, people of color are disproportionately incarcerated, but also victims of police brutality. And this is just a breakdown of majority of, this is just the general population, and then how many, what are the racial ethnic breakdowns in prison, and also people that are victims of police brutality. And as you can see here, the thing that's really stark is that people of color are disproportionately decimated by the system that's largely dominated by white folks. And I think that's important, that dynamic to recognize, because it is about systemic racism. And what this leads to ultimately is, even though Black and Latino folks are a minority of the US population, they still conform of majority of the incarcerated population. And again, in their lifetime, 1 out of 3 Black men is likely to be incarcerated, and that's 1 out of 6 Latino men as well. And again, this drastic disproportionate impact has been very specific to communities of color. So overall, there has been increases in incarceration, but as you can see here, looking at how it expanded, clearly Black and Browns have been hit the hardest. And to go back in time a little bit, why is this happening? Again, because crime is certainly not the issue. What it is really the politics of fear, and what America has been able to use to justify dehumanization of a lot of Black and brown people, which is the fear of the other. So this starts again right after slavery was supposedly abolished, right? But it was an economic system. And in this time, the South was lacking this economic system. And that kind of led to a need of a labor force. And that created the Black Codes, which were a bunch of laws that restricted the freedom of Black people by governing their conduct and legitimized a lot of terrible anti-Black violence and white supremacy. And that's exactly what led to the initial prison boom. Black people being arrested en masse for, again, arbitrarily acting properly, right? Loitering, vagrancy laws. And this was really to create a labor force where they were then forced to work to rebuild the Southern economy. So there is a important profitability to incarceration. And that's exactly what allows it to be such a hard system for us to take down. And the idea of criminality and Black communities is also something that's been built over time, and it's taken a long time to build it, and I would say centuries to build it. The claims that, especially around Black men as dangerous and savages, all of this language has been really a product of media propaganda, state propaganda, and it can be embodied best, as Dr. Clair mentioned, Emmett Till, who was a 14-year-old young Black boy who was lynched by white supremacists for, at the time, supposedly flirting with the white woman who, in 2008, she did admit that she falsified her testimony. And this is a perfect microcosm of a grander problem. And besides that, there's been active roles that the media and the cinema and the cinema and the state propaganda has played as well. And an example, again, is the movie Birth of a Nation, which hailed the KKK as heroes who protected the fragility of white women from Black men, which were, again, reduced to animals, essentially. And all of this justifies their dehumanization and also separation from society. And again, this is not unique. It's something that's happened over a long period of time, and it's very frequent, and it's still active. So now when we look at incarceration, I think we need to understand what is used as a justification to incarcerate people. And what it is this framing of Black communities as inherently violent, right? Black men were framed as super predators. And that's really what started this massive spike in incarceration. And really what it was the US declaring war on drugs. But the war on drugs, the word drugs was synonymous with Black people. And it takes a long time to even build accusation in the public's mind. Drug was not in something that essentially was strengthened by several different presidents, and that included increasing drug sentences. And if people might not know of some of the discrepancies, it's called the 100-to-1 sentencing rule, where vaccine used at the time by poor Black folks, someone would have to possess the 100 times that of cocaine, which again was something that was used by affluent, high socioeconomic groups and white people. And again, that discrepancy is important because it justifies incarcerating one group of people without really having a justification for doing that. And this is something that was very intentional, and I think this is what I do want to point out, and this was a advisor of President Nixon who I think here, this kind of encapsulates everything we're talking about. This quote, you want to know what this was really all about? Nixon had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Black people with heroin, then penalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did. And again, this is a key policymaker at the time who crafted a lot of the initial policies. So it's important to know that a lot of this does have insidious intentionality. And the reason we talk about drugs is because people are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses more than anything else. And this doesn't have any basis when we think about the research that has been built around this, because Black people, when it comes to rates of drug use and consumption, do use less than white people, but they're still stopped a lot more to be searched for drugs. And of course, that leads to a discrepancy in how likely they are to be incarcerated. Black people use less drugs, but are far more likely to be incarcerated for them. And now when we come back to this spike, when we're looking at where incarceration has really gone, another thing that happened that's not on this that I wanted to add is right after the war on drugs gained traction, something that happened was the privatization of prisons and the creation of private prison corporations. And this really made it really profitable to incarcerate people, which I think made it difficult for us to dismantle later on. So the prison industrial complex is a overlapping of the interests of the government and industries that use surveillance, policing, and corporations that do just about anything, and using imprisonment as a solution to serious economic, social, and political problems. And what it does is capitalizes from mass incarceration by having corporations run prisons and profiting significantly from them, but also using prison labor for companies. And again, there's a lot of people in prison, and there's a lot of corporations that are profiting from this labor, over 3,100, and contracting everything about incarceration, like food, medical facilities, telephone services, to private companies. And again, just a small example is how expensive it is for an inmate to make a phone call. And ultimately, all of this is upheld by the deep investment of lobbying groups and private corporations and politicians that work together to make sure legislature is in place to keep this expanding. And how profitable exactly? So the private prison industry has spiked in terms of their stocks. And on the right, so this is the two most common, most predominant corporations that govern the private prison industry. And you can see exactly how the Corrections Corporation of America stocks have grown compared to the S&P 500 index, which is 500 of the largest companies in the US. And I think it's important because which companies are involved in this and are contracting prison labor. Basically, just about anyone you probably know. There's a much longer, extensive list that I'll include in all the resources that I send out after this. So now coming to education, it's really difficult for us to understand why this might be happening, and ultimately, is education even a priority? Because across the different states in the United States, you have a greater amount that's being spent on incarcerating people than on educating them. And again, the yellow dots here cost per student and how much money is spent per inmate. And that's really what creates a school to prison pipeline, which is a funneling of children, troubled children, children with deep social inequities, often poor children, disabled children, and children of color, into the criminal justice system through policies and practices that occur in schools that then involve law enforcement. So it inherently connects all of these aspects together. Really, because the system that we're working with to begin with, the beginning of the pipeline, schools, aren't very good. They lack resources. Low-income minority neighborhood schools are underfunded and under-resourced, inherently based because of how education works in the United States. And these communities are also over-policed. But really, teachers here lack the resources to be able to support their students' needs. And education is a big, big part of incarceration because predominantly the biggest population of folks that are incarcerated don't have college degrees. A lot of them don't have high school diplomas. A lot of them actually just get a GED. And a lot of this is a factor that plays into how we're addressing social inequity. And that brings me to the second part of the pipeline, which is how do kids get put into prison in the first place? And that's zero tolerance policies. So these are policies that are punishing children for normal behavior that kids often are experiencing in schools, largely because they're dealing with a lot of things. And it was institutionalized, kind of the spike or the start of institutionalizing it was the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994, where a lot of states started to adopt laws to mandate expulsion for a year from school for anything that could be perceived as violence. And the problem was this was so broad that kids were being suspended for just about anything, for bringing ibuprofen and Midol with their parents' permission because it was considered drugs, tools, scissors, toys, making finger guns, and these are all real cases. Fighting with friends, which included verbal arguments, being tardy, and again, anything that fell under the umbrella of insubordination. The problem is none of this is actually helpful to correct negative behavior, and what it does is just has negative outcomes. It doesn't actually help with any of the problems that we see when it comes to engagement of children in schools. And largely, majority, 95% of suspensions are nonviolent offenses, things like violations of dress code. And all this does is create a more social inequity and negatively impacts student learning and gets kids into this pipeline where they're just stuck and never able to usually come out of it. And again, Dr. Clair did mention a lot of these disparities, but 40% of students that are expelled from schools each year are Black. 70% of arrests that are made in schools are Black or Latino kids. And all of this has serious implications because education is being compromised. 68% of men in state or federal prison don't have a high school diploma, right? So where are our priorities? And not just students of color, but the victims of these policies are low-income students and students with disabilities and LGBTQ students as well. And this is, again, just showing how drastic some of those discrepancies can be, where you can see that when it comes to Indigenous and Black and Latino children, there is such a stark disparity and such a increase in the likelihood of them being criminalized and punished rather than their needs being addressed. And the right is school suspension rates, and you can see again the discrepancy between Black, Latino, and even Asian kids compared to white kids. Now, it's not just schools, which is important because it's any form of social inequity that children are experiencing. And the peak of that is the foster care system. So the same impact that we saw that schools being used as this priming ground for kids to be funneled into prison is exactly what the foster care system is, where a lot of the children in the foster care system are also going through the same issues. And 70%, and this was specific to California, but 70% of the inmates in California State Prison are former foster care youth. And that should be telling us that there's a different problem that lies at the core of why this is happening. And police kind of come in the middle too, where they're connecting schools to prisons. Schools ultimately outsource discipline to law enforcement, where they're then charged with regulating these children. And police are mostly present in urban low-income schools where majority students are students of color. And they end up incarcerating low-income Black, Latino, and Indigenous students at the highest rates. And what these schools often lack is counselors, nurses, psychologists, and social workers, and other systems to truly provide these students with the resources to be able to truly address their needs. And that brings me to the end of the pipeline, which is recidivism. And recidivism is the likelihood, which is again high, but the idea that people, once they enter the criminal justice system, are most likely to fall back into that same system again. And the likelihood of someone returning to the criminal justice system increase over time, and by that I mean as in the time from when they're first released to when they're arrested again. And majority of folks in the incarceration system are repeat offenders. And again, this is because of what happens after they leave. And what happens is exactly what Dr. Clair talked about in terms of racialized status based on incarceration, where there's this whole second-class citizenship status that we've created in America, where being a part of the system allows you to no longer be an active member of society anymore. So with the felony, you cannot vote. So 48 states bar people from prison to vote in the first place. But beyond that, once you have a felony conviction on your record, you can't vote either. And you can't access public housing, equitable healthcare, employment, loans. So what ends up happening is people leave and they get into worse conditions of social inequity, poverty, bad health. And it makes it very difficult for them to not fall back into the system, again, for the same reasons that we talked about. So at the root of all of this is a collision of two things that are incredibly, incredibly problematic, which is racism and capitalism, and how they inherently need to work together to be able to uphold these injustices. These injustices are so deeply rooted in our society because they are profitable. Since a person in America is charged with a misdemeanor, their entire process of going through the pipeline of the criminal justice system, every step of the way, whatever they do, everything is privatized. And what that means is there's profits that are being generated from that system. And therefore, there is a likelihood of more people being funneled into that system. Now, there's decades of research that I don't have the time to go into that show that punishment through structures, racist institutions like prisons and police do not actually keep our communities safer. If anything, they increase racial, social, and economic inequity, and they decrease education rates, and they put people into a situation where they have very few options and are often exposed to greater problems like we're talking about that are so clear in this pandemic. And how do we really pull out of this? And this is something that I'm going to not be able to talk about, but I think we do need to engage in conversations about this, is thinking about restorative justice, which is thinking about, do we really care about these individuals, right? Are they really part of our community? And if they are, then just punishing them and creating these conditions that don't really allow them to ever be functioning, productive members of our society don't create any kind of accountability for us either. They don't make us any safer. So restorative justice involves addressing victim reparation, community being involved, as well as having roles for individuals to take part in that bring people together in a way where we're rethinking what really keeps us safe and what is the point of policing in the first place. And I want to briefly mention this, that right around the same time as the United States was dealing with the war on drugs, so were a lot of different countries. And one anecdote is Portugal, where they decided to go in the opposite direction, where they decriminalized possession of and use of drugs. And what that led to is a dramatic decrease in drug-induced deaths, but also in general incarceration, prison overcrowding, the spread of infectious diseases like HIV. And over time, what that's led to is Portugal now having the lowest drug use rate of any Western European country. And again, that's important because when we start to address the core problem, because not only did they decriminalize, they took a lot of their funding away from incarceration and put it towards community development programs that involved education and health and mental health and other social services that target rehabilitation. And that's, I think, what we need to be thinking of long term, to divest from these racist institutions and systems that are not helping anyone and invest in our communities instead, because we really can go a lot longer with our dollar when we think about it. The cost that it takes to incarcerate an adult or to incarcerate a young child, with that same money, there's so much more positivity that can be done by redirecting that money into social and community services and prioritizing education. And that's really how we sustain ourselves in the long term. And I'm going to end by with a personal plea. And again, like I mentioned, I mentored a lot of incarcerated youth. And let me stop sharing. And I want to, this is all de-identified, but I want to just list 5 of my mentees and what they were in there for. And I spent anywhere between a year to 2 years watching them go from the start of their sentence to when they walked out. And so John was ultimately arrested and found his way to Camp Miller for a water balloon fight. Michael for being tardy. He struggled with a lot of mental health issues, including autism, and had trouble being on time. Jonathan for sleeping in class too many times. Jonathan was 14 and was the only income earner in his entire family, and he was working at night and was tired at school in the morning. Blake for defending his mother from her abuser, who, as he had done many times before, was about to beat her to death. Though he did not do anything wrong, Blake's lawyer told him to falsely confess because it was easier. Travis for verbally getting into an argument with a peer who called him racial slurs and bullied him, and ultimately for trying to run away from an officer who was called on him to handle him. And the reason he ran away was because he had watched his Black father get killed by a cop when he was 5 years old in front of him. And that's the last thing I want to end with, because that's what's at stake here. That's really what's at stake here. And we're not just on the outside of the system, we're in the underbelly. And we are actively perpetuating it. And we're actively the reason that there's bad health outcomes. And we can't talk about it as it's an external issue. And until we actively address it head on and acknowledge our impact and our role in addressing racism within science and medicine itself, then we're not going to be able to really overcome any of these inequities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. So we're going to have a Q&A session after a final round of poetry. So everyone, I'm sure you have some great questions for our speakers. Please direct those to the Q&A section so we can get those answered and have a great closing discussion. But before that, let's get into some more art that truly brings life into these statistics that we've been learning about today, and hopefully we'll continue to learn about in our daily lives from this point forward. So next up, we have another piece by Taylor Code, and then we will continue on with Alyesha Wise and Arts Quiros. Taylor, you got it.
Oh, I thought this was
Yeah, it's
yeah, Alyesha or Art. Yeah, yeah. So
Okay, okay. So let's swing it on over to Alyesha then.
All right, y'all. Thank you again. And here we go. If my sister survived last night, I want to know what saved her. Perhaps she left her keys in a house. The cop reached down for his coffee, a baby cried, and the bad guy turned his head. If my sister survived last night, I need to know how so I can be sure it happens again, so I can have less bad dreams at night, so I can rely on something more than her survival is ultimately what Black people do. We survive. If my sister lived to see another dawn, if she picked my brother up from his trap set, exchanged I love yous, dropped him off at his front porch, I need to know that if they die, it was not while doing bad things, because then they are the forgotten. Because then people forget Black death is cause and effect, a planted virus. Biggie spit in our story, Chief Keef knowing how it feels. It is the officer not able to notice the trauma, though the trauma notices him. Allison calls me every day. My mom is the type to always leave a voicemail, always announce who's calling, always state the time of the call, and always tell me how everyone in the family is doing. I have already mourned the days she does not call. And on the days she does not call, when she does not pick up, I get antsy. I see an article online that reads, Camden man shot, and my hands begin to sweat. Before I open it, I regret how shaky I become, the violence that possesses me. I remind myself, stress isn't good for my health, and I deep breathe. I spit a verse by Kendrick. I call my mother back to back, and when she finally answers, I yell, she scoffs, I apologize, I breathe, I am not okay. I am a tiny bite of this big old chunk of trauma. God, is your belly full yet? Do you know where the rope begins? There is so much unraveling to be done here. Please tell me the tale is correct, that you are just planning some far off planet that belongs to us. A planet scientists claim they have discovered, but on the day they get close enough, they shall burn at the sight. Me, applying my galactic eyeliner, my sister's children playing in each other's purple hair, my brother sitting on a stoop, rolling up a joint in any colored t-shirt he likes. So much Black joy uninterrupted while they are still stuck on conquer and conquer. Wouldn't that be sweet? Wouldn't that be a sweet, sweet rejoice? Wouldn't it?
Thank you. So let's have our last piece by Art Quiros.
Gentrification's creating economic conflicts in communities of color, like neighborhoods fleeing from gunners. Black and brown folks forced off their own lands, cops occupying pueblos like Jewish bullets in Palestine. I'm like a Muslim black sheep, I can't sleep without feeling like many men looking coming after me. A legal injunction signed off by officials so police could try to put fear in us like Protestant Bibles. Oppression 101 built by the 405 to divide the rich and poor like Berlin walls with barbed wire. This is undeclared warfare, like U.S. drones in Yemen and Minutemen at the border straight killing, funded by the USA, more like the KKK, lynching brothers and secretly getting away. Like Zionists invested in Israel, giving money to Mexico, locking up Zapatistas in prison cells. I take my seat in the circle of grown men, hands cleansed by white chalk and spirit. I no longer fear it, but still, I choke on my words, caught tongue-tied by traditional songs. Resting along a log, my thoughts slide down a redwood tree. Branches catch memories of me that hang floating with the fog. The sun sits on top, a fiery eye looking for God. But I'm trapped in the dark, shadows outline my spine. My guard up like a gray halo, unstable, uncontainable chronicles unable to form. I absorb war-torn souls to scorn being born, accepting challenges like champions. We open scabs and dab at our own distress. The painful past with which I've been blessed. I once tried to achieve my father's dreams, a child chief reaching for something he believed, until I started to deceive. I had to hold my own when I left home. Shoot 'em up, bang, bang. Alone I stood, a military mind brainwashed by gangster rap, marching to murder tracks. Pop stood in amazement, making faces at my court cases, browsing bystanders, my parents, undocumented citizens. Their hearts got shattered. I was as guilty as innocently naive when they convicted me. But today, mi corazón gives birth to words that bloom in these warm rooms. Tears turn up the volume, wounds blossom from their cocoons when I begin to interlace, twist, and braid my pain, weaving a cobweb quilt that will one day wrap around this punctured earth that hurts, healing a world that must start here first. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. That was wonderful. We had a great set of poems and discussions today. And now we'll be moving on to the Q&A. Still, if you have questions, if you think of, please submit them and we'll ask them at this time. We have our first question. So BIPOC internalize racism starting from early childhood, and especially as a result of implicit bias and explicit racism from teachers. Should there be mandatory ethics training for K through 12 educators? And how can K through 12 school psychologists advocate for marginalized students and equitable practices? This can be answered by anybody.
I can get us started, and I think folks can kind of jump in because I think everyone has a lot of important insight on this. I really think it's all educators, right? Not just K through 12, but K through 12 educators, college, community college, and educators in science and medicine. What we fundamentally lack is a awareness of all of these issues and exactly how they impact the kids that we deal with and who we're teaching, but also the communities that we serve. And if we do say that we are serving these communities for their betterment, then we need to have all of this contextualized. So I think there has to be mandatory training. And again, a lot of the times that we have implicit bias training, the people that need to be in the room are often not in the room. And it's just a bunch of us sitting around trying to talk about our own issues. And often we do have a lot of workshops and trainings for kids of color in high school and in college and later on for them to go deal with their trauma and for them to talk about how to deal with racism and how to deal with feeling like like the other in whatever space they're in. But we don't have any of the opposite, right? Enough of the opposite, which is addressing the problem in the first place. And in terms of psychologists, I think the framework which we think about mental health to begin with is very problematic. And what we need to do is decolonize mental health and think about, again, all of these issues like systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, right? Like generations and generations and generations of your community being decimated and being subject to such dehumanization that does something to you. And by that, I mean actually does something to your mental and physical health. And ultimately that leads to bad health in your entire community. And unless we acknowledge that, it's really difficult to address for psychologists in schools to really talk to their kids, right? Because a lot of times we tend to whatever it is. But basically, we tend to take problems that they're going through and try to diagnose them and try to figure out exactly what could be causing them without acknowledging everything in their community, everything their community has been through, everything they've been through, and how that affects them, often making them the problem, right? And over-prescribing medication and things like that, when really what we need to do is start talking about what they might be going through and acknowledge their pain, that there's nothing wrong with them. They just live in an unequal society. And I think that's the first step to moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Khan. Sort of, we need to understand the root causes. I'll also sort of add that some research on training has surprisingly shown that training can backfire. Sort of when people aren't invested in the idea of dealing with and thinking through really hard what racism means and how they are racist and how they perpetuate racism. And so I think training can be a first step, but sort of following along with Dr. Khan's presentation, I think one thing that's super critical is just removing these tools of criminalization in schools in the first place, right? These laws and policies that allow school officials with immense discretion and immense bias to be able to trap students and pull them into the criminal legal system. And so, just thinking about the parallel actually within sort of the criminal legal system and the reform and abolition movement that's going on there, a lot of the conversation is training of police, of prosecutors. It's just not enough because we're bolstering an existing system that's already so problematic. And so what we should be doing is really thinking about abolishing the systems or transforming these systems and doing exactly what Dr. Khan said, is putting in those inputs that we know actually help people thrive.
Yeah, and I want to also say for folks that might not be familiar, this is not necessarily saying that we're not advocating for a methodical, precise, research-driven, evidence-driven backing of the incremental progress that we want to do to build up to this, right? But if all we're doing is these incremental changes without keeping the ultimate goal in mind, and all we're doing is strengthening these systems, right? And that's exactly what funding police trainings and just funding bias trainings without acknowledging all of the problem and dismantling those racist systems does, right? It just strengthens these institutions and it puts more money into them and takes away more money from communities of color. So we fundamentally need to do a divestment investment model, right? Which starts with pulling away money. And again, money's everything. I think that you can connect any kind of oppression in the world, and art, thank you for beautifully connecting a lot of the problems that are going on in the world and how communities are suffering with money. And you can follow the money and it will tell you exactly how our liberations are tied. And if we can take money away from these systems and redirect them into our communities, that's like the only model rather than just strengthening some of these systems that exist in the first place.
Great, thank you for those responses. Dr. Ayesha Khan, I was particularly moved by your presentation, and as a US taxpayer, I'd like to know how, as a taxpayer, how we contribute to upholding incarceration.
And I'm gonna refer to Art's poem again. And actually, maybe after I give a quick answer, Art, you can kind of expand on your poem and talk about it a little bit in terms of the motivations of why you wrote it, because I listened to Art's poem when I was, a kid, when I was probably 20 years old. And that actually got me thinking about how our oppressions are connected, and not metaphorically. When I say, solidarity from here to Palestine, I'm not saying that metaphorically. I mean, literally. Literally, the systems that we're fighting are the exact same. And the easiest way to track that is actually by following the US taxpayer dollar and where it goes. And a lot of US taxpayer money, billions and billions, does go into upholding incarceration and ultimately funding systems that uphold incarceration, like policing, but it also goes elsewhere. So part of that is, over $3.2 billion of aid go to upholding the Zionist regime, which Art talked about, which oppresses and upholds a apartheid and active occupation of Palestine. And from there, that same money is funneled back into an investment system where money is generated. And folks might not know this, but Israel is India's biggest arms dealer. So that dollar, that US taxpayer dollar, is going from our pockets here to Palestine, and then in the form of arms to India. And India actively uses these arms to occupy Kashmir, another highly marginalized group of people that are having their lands occupied. So the US taxpayer dollar directly contributes to a lot of these injustices, which does not mean that, you know, oh, it's too late. Like we're already, you know, what it should lead to is us realizing how complicit we are and that we're already on the side of the oppressor, right? We're not neutral by any means. We're actively putting our dollar to a lot of times oppressing our own communities back home for immigrants. And we're hoping that us actively taking steps and being actionable in our anti-racist solidarity here in the United States maybe might, you know, kind of tip the scales where we're back to square one and we're neutral, but we're by no means neutral right now. And Art, I think you can kind of expand on that.
I mean, I think you hit it spot on. A lot of what you're saying is exactly why I wrote the poem. I think at the time that I was writing that piece, I was involved with an organization that, you know, had a bus riders campaign where they were heavily involved in trying to help bus riders keep certain bus lines open, where the MTA out here in LA was shutting down certain bus lines where people maybe once would pay, you know, one fee to get from one place to another place, now had to pay maybe 4 times the fee for 4 different buses they had to take because they cut, you know, a bus line that would directly take them to work every day. You know, things of that nature that we don't always think about, that you know, people of color regularly deal with. You know, you have a lot of sheriffs that are involved with the metro system, where they'll be waiting at the metro stops and frisking young people of color, asking them where they're going, checking to see if they're paying for tickets, and then incarcerating them if they violate anything, instead of trying to support and help them get to their destinations. All of these things that are oppressing people of color. And, you know, in a way, you know, we pay for our taxes. I pay for taxes every year. And I think by the time, like, I realize that we're voting for something, I don't have the information, you know, I don't know exactly what I'm voting for. Like, a lot of the things get like passed hidden behind the surface. And we don't always have access to that information because we're just caught up in the struggle of trying to pay the bills, trying to pay the rent. You know, I'm a parent of a 2-year-old daughter. I'm primarily the person who makes the most money in my household, pays all the bills, of, you know, things of that nature. And coming from a family where both of my parents migrated from other countries and we're just trying to survive in America, you know, it's just one of those things where, unless you have access to that information or you go and seek it out, you know, you're not going to learn these things in school. You know, I was never taught how to pay a bill. I was never taught how to pay my taxes. I was never taught so many things, you know, how to advocate for myself, that I don't understand why our system is still forcing our young people to go to school, and then they're coming out of this system not knowing anything that they need to survive in this world. You know what I'm saying? So really trying to figure out how do we reform all these things, or like you guys are saying, start from the ground up, is primarily where I think it's at right now. In order for us to learn how these things are affecting us, you know, effectively.
Can I also add something real quick? So I think it's amazing if we look, and I think organizers are actually doing a really good job showing this. So if you just, so in Austin, for example, I know organizers have done a city budget tool where you can look and see literally how much money is spent on your police department in your city. In Palo Alto, for example, $43 million or something like that is spent on the police department from the city budget. 1.6 million goes to community organizations, right? And we know that nonprofit community organizations, there are empirical studies that show that they have a causal effect on reducing the types of criminalized behavior that we're actually interested in reducing. So it's amazing how much more money we're spending on policing and prisons and other carceral institutions than we are spending on things that actually have shown to reduce crime and also not increase other forms of violence, such as police violence. But the other thing that I'll say is the Ferguson report from the Department of Justice, I think it must have come out in 2016, right after Michael Brown was killed. It also shows the way that cities and city budgets intentionally are exploiting, right? So it's not just collecting from the tax base, but it's also exploiting people through their criminalization intentionally to boost up the city budget through fines and fees and legal financial obligations that disproportionately impact Black and Brown people. So the city's role in looking at our local budgets is super important in the conversation. So I really appreciate that question.
And I'll add another layer I forgot to add, which is college campuses. Any university in the United States actively uses student tuition to invest in these systems as well. So your money in tuition and fees basically goes into this one pot, which is endowments, that then get reinvested into different corporations. And being a public institution is unique because that allows you as someone who's paying tuition to have access to know exactly where your money is going. And part of that was created by the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, which is allows you to have public information, like make a request for that information to be made public. And that's exactly what we did at the University of California, Los Angeles, where we made a Freedom of Information request and asked for students to know exactly where our tuition dollars are going and where the University of California is invested in. And that's ultimately how we found out the list of organizations and corporations that they're invested in that are actively involved in not just the prison industrial complex, but directly benefiting from prison labor, but also companies that uphold apartheid in Palestine. So again, a lot of this is having access to that information. And like Art and Dr. Clair both said, arming yourself with the knowledge to be able to know what your rights are and know what you can and can't access. And this you can access if you're at a public institution.
Thank you everyone for your input. So while we're on the topic of understanding where our money is going, in addition to not only our tax money, this question is about using our own personal money. So many companies today use prison labor, and there are efforts to stop people from buying these companies' goods. Will boycotting these stores help correct the bigger issue? This question's for anyone, but I'm not the expert, but I would just think that, boycotting has worked in some forms in the past. If anyone would like to chime in or give examples.
Yeah, that's actually what contributed largely in terms of where the United States was involved and what they were able to do from here to addressing the South African apartheid. I wouldn't say completely dismantling it, but at least changing the system in the way that it existed, which was divesting funding and divesting from institutions and companies involved in the apartheid, but also boycotting any corporations. And that's largely a movement that's been reframed today for a lot of social justice issues. So the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which is also what's a movement that's very directed against dismantling Israeli occupation of Palestine, is about boycotting individual companies and their products that are involved in human rights violations. And those are very clear and directed. There's been a whole body of research done to back them up, including like real evidence and exactly how they're involved, whether it's through building the apartheid wall, whether it's through military, whether it's something that's just built on Israeli settlements, right, where Palestinians have to be kicked out. And a simple example is Sabra Hummus, right? So when you look at these lists, so these are publicly available, you just have to Google the BDS movement, there's a list of companies. When you divest your personal dollar from this, not only are you actively, removing yourself from being active in this system, but ultimately what you're doing is creating a system where it's not profitable for them to continue oppressing these communities. So I think it does work and it does help, but it's all a multi-pronged approach. It can't be the only thing that you do, right? Because we're still working within the framework of capitalism and thinking about our dollar. And that inherently is not enough, right? What we need to be doing is that, which also includes grassroots organizing and educating your community, your family, your friends, talking to people about it, because your personal dollar is not going to go the longest way as compared to your collective community's dollar. And thinking about how you can make this work in a broader community scale.
Thank you for your input. So this question is for Dr. Clair. I'm sorry.
No, I just kind of wanted to speak to
oh, go ahead.
The portion of the question that had to do with a list of companies that invest in convict leasing. And you're basically included in that list. I mean, I don't have access to the whole list myself, but I was incarcerated, and I was leased out as a convict, you know, and we were leased out to local agencies, like the fairgrounds. When they would have the rodeo in town, the people that run the fairgrounds would reach out to the institution which I was housed and schedule a crew of inmates to come clean out the horse stalls. Or when when it snowed really bad and they needed the senior citizen homes, when they needed the snow removed from the senior citizen home, they used convict leasing. Just something just as simple as picking up trash along the highway to try to beautify. They use city, you know, the city crew. So the local governments are you know, kind of like at the top of the list who invest in like city counseling. I mean, city council. I'm sorry about that. Convict leasing. So, you know, you might want to start there. Well, that's a good place to start for someone who's trying to, you know, who's trying to help divest from that system. You know, you can start right there with your own local governments, you know, and kind of go from there. You know, a lot of the information about the public company, the big corporations that use convict leasing, that's kind of like at the push of a button. But, you know, but anyway, I just wanted to address that part. Sorry about that, for interrupting you.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah, so thank you for giving that input and sharing this a more personal perspective that puts us into mind. But this next question is for Dr. Clair, but anyone feel free to answer. What are your thoughts on the breakdown of race ethnicity with many of these statistics, including Hispanic? To elaborate, I know many who do not easily fit within these categories, such as Black and Indigenous individuals from South America. What can we take from data that help us see social effects when one's social status is so intersectional, especially in the discrete racial categories that are commonly used?
That's a great question. That's something that frustrates a lot of researchers. So most of the statistics are based on what's called administrative data. So these are data that are collected by some government agency. So for example, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is housed in the Department of Justice, collects data from police departments. And police departments are reporting data based on whatever sort of process that they want. And we don't really, as the FBI really doesn't, the DOJ really doesn't know exactly how each local police department is categorizing people. I will say when I've done work on the ground and been in police departments and courthouses, I can see that the racial and ethnic categorization, particularly for Hispanic or Latinx, however they classify it in the specific state you're in, and however they include Brazilians or not within that classification and category, it really can vary. And the actors themselves who are doing the racializing are the ones who are categorizing. It's not the individual who is identifying themselves within a racial category, right? And so then you get discrepancies where maybe the police officer looked at someone and racialized them as Black, and then the probation department, which houses the court statistics, looks at the person and racializes them as Latinx, right? And so the boxes that are checked vary across the same individual. So it's super frustrating. And I'll just say last, so sometimes what happens is there aren't statistics. Basically, they drop the Hispanic category because you can be of a racial group technically in the United States that's of the ethnicity Hispanic. And so sometimes they only look at Black-white disparities because of that. But then those Black-white disparities, if they don't drop the Hispanic category and they include people who identify as both white and Hispanic into the white group, that's going to lower, right, the disparity that we actually see between Black and white people, because you'd imagine that Latinx people are probably being treated a little bit more harshly than people who are white and not Latinx. But if they're included in the white category, that sort of, if you will, sort of dilutes the effect that we see in the magnitude of the racial disparities. So it's super complex and complicated. Each researcher does their own different thing, and the statistics can be pretty messy. But the main thing to understand is we're really interested in seeing how the legal officials and legal actors are racializing people rather than a person's own self-identification, because that's where the racism is coming in.
Yeah, and I'll add quickly to that, the dilution factor that Dr. Clair talked about. Another huge contributor to that is how folks from the Middle East and North Africa are classified, which is as white. And again, they have no option, and that's how consensus data is collected as well. And again, that's fundamentally huge, right? Because when we think about policing and surveillance and all of those statistics, and how Middle Eastern communities and North African communities are over-policed, do face a lot more police brutality, and a lot of those issues, those are categorized as white now. And that, again, further reduces some of that disparity. So again, just, yeah, everything Dr. Clair said, I think, in terms of how people identify, we don't really have a choice.
All right, thank you for that. To Alyesha, Arturo, or Taylor, art is clearly a very powerful way for people to express themselves and share stories with many people. How do you feel your art has personally helped your journeys, and what are your thoughts on the role of art in activism?
I can speak. I think art and activism pretty much go, a lot of times they go hand in hand. I think that definitely I'm thinking about poems and how they affected me. And there's a lot of messages that, you know, people probably try to give to us, like, since we are young, you know, teachers, mentors, whatnot. Not saying I had many mentors and stuff where I was from, but there's a lot of messages that are tried to be passed to us, but there's something about the way I listen to it when it's put in a poem or some type of other piece of art. Art is another type of language in communication, and it helps to express things in ways that you feel like you're hearing it for the first time. And I really think it opens us up to want to act. What was the first part of the question again? Oh, did you miss it?
So how do you feel your art has personally helped your journeys?
Oh, and yes, mine, just like I said in the poem, if it wasn't for poetry, I mean, I really can't tell you where I would be overall, but I know for a fact that that's what pulled me out of things. No one asked me questions. No one really said, hey, how do you feel today? Like the simple things, the important things. Why are you down right now? Everything just felt like you exist, and it's either, you know, it's like punishment or you just keep existing. And I came from a pretty, you know, overall stable household, but it's a lot that comes with that, being in the hood, especially where I'm from in Camden, New Jersey. And the love language and a lot of, it's just a lot of missing factors from my teachers, from parenting, no mentors. And when poetry came in, I was definitely on a really interesting path, especially around the age of 17. And if it wasn't for poems, I would probably be in a whole different situation. I'm thinking about my siblings. I'll keep it short. My siblings, we grew up in the same household. And I know there's different factors with gender. You know, I'm thinking about my brothers right now, but they are in totally different situations. My brother who's incarcerated right now, my other brother who's around 40 years old and just feels like he's getting his life together. So I'm just thinking about like the same situation, but I found art and how that pulled me out, whereas they did not. So.
The art saved my life, personally. I just say that cut and dry. You know, through my art, I was able to face up to some really traumatizing situations that shaped my life in a way that I did not want it to be shaped. And you know, so the prison experience was like the nightmare that kind of triggered my awakening. You know what I mean? I was there long enough to see so many people recidivate. Like I was there long enough, and I saw some people get out and come back and get out and come back, like in like 5-time cycles. You know what I mean? Like, and I, like, and every time I saw that, that was the most scariest thing about the prison experience. But every time I saw that, it was like there was a voice in my head saying to me, "You better fix what's broken inside of you, or otherwise this is the reality that you'll have to look forward to, you know. And I really didn't know where to begin, so I started asking myself questions like, damn, you know, what happened in my life that made it so normal for me to make decisions that put me at risk of going to prison. And I would answer those questions through my poetry, you know what I'm saying? So you know, the poetry, the art of poetry was the vessel which helped me to actually reclaim my life, because all the traumatizing things that I went through, you know, being molested, being beat up, bullied, shot, and all of those things, I didn't have a healthy outlet for it. So basically, I would just try to numb the pain of those things through drugs and alcohol and other types of what do I want to, let me choose my words carefully here, but you know, other types of mischievous behavior, you know what I'm saying? So getting it out in the art and owning everything, and it took away the shame and the power that, you know, the guilty conscience had over me. And it was like, you know what, I did some things that I'm not necessarily proud of, you know, trying to escape this pain or this trauma, you know, but that doesn't define who I am, you know. So it empowered me to be accountable for what the rest of my life is going to be like going forward. So it saved my life.
I'll add to that and say that for myself, art was also something, and poetry and music were things that allowed me to educate myself, you know, and allow myself to pick up where LAUSD and the school system sort of left me. You know, I would say in middle school, I had substitute teachers for math and for English and science, almost like for some of those for months. You know, we'd have a different teacher. Sometimes we'd have a teacher for like a week and then another teacher, you know what I'm saying? And they didn't know where one person left off and where the other, you know, where they should pick up. And so that, you know, by the time I was in high school, I was like failing and just could barely do mathematics, you know, when before in elementary, I was succeeding, I was getting A's and B's, and I actually ended up in an enrichment program, and then just kind of failed all through middle school. And in high school, I was sort of just trying to survive, because at that point, police were looking at me, gangs were looking at me. I was just trying to navigate. To get from my house to school was complicated. And, you know, Tupac and other artists were people that I resonated with, and were people that were giving me the strength and allowing me to sort of like understand what was going on in my society that I couldn't understand. And it's one of the reasons why I picked up rapping, why I started doing poetry, why I started writing. But looking at where I'm at now and thinking about that 16-year-old kid that at 18 was incarcerated, and you know, looking at the similar things that Taylor was talking about, and realizing like I'm not trying to end up back over here, but also like maybe I'm here for a reason, and maybe there's a purpose behind all this for me to see all these things. The way that the prison guards are beating on the inmates, the way that we can't even look a prison guard in the eye without getting yelled at or getting reprimanded or getting chained to a bench and being left there overnight to urinate and you know, do you know what I'm saying? Like just being tied to this, like this prison, this jail, this whole other world that was like a nightmare, you know, and leaving that place and realizing that poetry and writing gave me an opportunity to kind of flip that and go into these incarcerated, these jails for young people, and help these young people see a better vision for themselves moving forward. Like poetry allowed me to transform my past into something powerful to help these young people move forward. And you know, I see that strength in poetry when I go into these places where young people are falling in love with writing and teaching themselves how to read and write. And I think that's very important, because it's something that is necessary and needed for these young people.
Thank you three for sharing your experiences. So going off of this question, rap music is commonly used to discuss the injustices against Black Americans, especially related to police violence. People tend to cast rap music in a bad light rather than view it as a healing outlet, or rap artists are solely viewed as entertainment. What are your thoughts on privileged groups capitalizing off of Black people's art/pain?
I think I'm waiting until I have a perfect answer, and I just need to go off my chest. I mean, I think my thoughts here are, you know, hip hop and rap is so just in language, in the way I guess people look at it, it's criminalized. It's like, you know, point fingers at it, like that's the bad stuff. But at the same time, it's very much hip hop is very much I don't know if the word, it's not fetishized. It's everywhere in America. I was about to quote Erykah Badu for a second, when the song where she says, you know, it's bigger than religion, hip hop. It's everywhere. It moves so many things in media. And the reason why I love rap a lot is because there's a lot of storytelling in it. It's a lot of I see you. I understand the issues with it. I understand it so much, and it definitely needs to be talked about. But when I hear hip hop, a lot of times I hear my students, I hear my brothers, I hear my younger self, and I also hear there's a lot of amazing, impeccable storytelling in it. And I'm gonna get to your, I know this isn't like directly answering a question, I'm gonna get there. And it's so much in there, so much culture, and again, a lot of story. And I feel when groups who aren't directly, you know, privileged groups benefiting from such a delicate and amazing and vulnerable art form that again is has such a bad light that's shined on it, but at the same time people just use it and profit off of it. It's very frustrating, and it's just, I think, one example of how this country benefits a lot off of Black and brown people, Black and brown art, and how much as while they're gaining from it, they're also saying like, you know, how dare you? And I think it's all part of the game. But you know, I'm a fan. I didn't know my clothing line. I'm a fan of hip hop. Thank you for that, that question.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the saddest facts in that whole dynamic is the fact that people don't really believe the messages and the stories that are coming through hip hop until it's just like all up in your face. You know what I'm saying? And earlier, you know, we mentioned things like Dr. Clair mentioned something about the Black codes, how, you know, that came into play to like help keep you know, Black people oppressed in this country, you know, as far as economics go. And I didn't personally learn about that stuff until, you know, a couple years ago when I was I took an African history of the African American at a community college. But if people would listen to hip hop and listen, you know, and take heed to the stories and the messages coming through, like, you know, we probably be light years ahead of where we are now in terms of coming up with a solution to this structural racism and you know, and things of that nature. You know what I mean? And people that's just in the ugly reality of life. Period. I mean, you got opportunists out there. You know, some people, you know, they you got a lot of people that use whatever method they can to, you know, to push their agenda. You know, that's just part of the game. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if it was, you know, all in the spirit of righteousness, yes, you know, people that profit and capitalize off of, you know, Black indigenous people's culture, they should definitely, you know, it should be some kind of tax included with that. You know what I mean? Like, you know, on the you know, they got the Social Security tax, or the, you know, the taxes for the schools that, you know, in the area that you live in. You know, we should maybe incorporate, you know, some type of retribution that way. You know what I'm saying? But just personally, I love hip hop because it's just so raw and uncut. You know what I'm saying? You know, I'm not the sharpest knife in the box. You know what I'm saying? So sometimes I need to hear a message that's just clear, raw, and uncut, you know, without having to, you know, dig through the research and the analytics and all of that. So, you know what I'm saying? So, you know, anyway, that's my 2 cents on that one.
I also want to add like a thing about academia. I think a lot of the reasons where folks don't consume music and legitimize it as a legitimate form of learning and education is because of respectability politics and tone policing. So in academia, you know, and in general, just the ivory tower of how we think about education, we always think about conforming to a certain standard of acting a certain way, right? Which is very much about centering whiteness, because a lot of Black, Indigenous cultures of and communities of color have cultures that are very, very different, right? Are just in the way that we talk, the way that we walk, the way that we, and that's partly why I use my hands when I talk a lot, is because where I come from, it's very normal to use, you know, to be loud, to be boisterous, to talk, you know, openly, to dance, to sing. Everything we do is through that form of expression. And why? Is because it's helped us survive, right? When you have nothing, and when your community is literally dying and being oppressed, sometimes art is all you have. And I think a lot of people might be seeing this in the pandemic, right? Not in the same way, but like you might be realizing how your crutch in life right now is art, right? What you're watching, what you're listening to, what you're reading. And that's because a lot of us don't have access to a lot of these external factors, but to communities of color, it's helped us as that's been the avenue that we've survived with, right? And then we come here, and that's when I started changing my mannerisms, because I quickly realized that I couldn't be this loud, I couldn't talk like this, I couldn't act like this, because people would perceive me a certain way. And then in academia, I changed, you know, almost everything about myself to fit that, you know, that respectability character, right? And ultimately, that's what changes everything, because just like both Taylor and Alyesha, I think, said that a lot of the education that we get is not even through the best forms that some people learn, right? Not all of us learn traditionally by being lectured at, right? And even the act of being lectured involves power dynamics, right? Where you presume that someone doesn't know what they're talking about, and therefore you're going to teach them. So it involves a savior complex. So inherently, how we teach each other in our culture is by taking that away, right? And part of taking that away is in art, because people are speaking to you, right? And they're with you, and it's not coming from that power dynamic perspective that we traditionally use in academia to teach. And I think thinking about that, a lot of people learn by listening, by touching, by feeling, by hearing. I think art takes all of that into account, because there are different mediums of art, right? And lastly, I think our histories are extremely whitewashed. And that means that people in power get to decide what's valid and what's not. So a lot of our histories are distorted. And that's exactly why going to school, we don't learn what we need to from our textbooks, right? So art is literally communities of color trying to teach people about what happened to them, because art is a form of historical record, right? It's a way of documenting exactly what happened and what their experiences were that are completely absent from our textbooks. So it's probably the most authentic form of history, if anything.
Yeah, I'll add to that real quick. You know, we have a studio at Street Poets, and we've had it for about 10 years. I just put a link in the chat where you can find a lot of our music and poetry that includes a lot of the young people that we've worked with throughout the years. And so much brilliant talent has come through that studio. And we've been privileged to work with young people that have shared stories through poetry and rhythm, and you know, sing song. And one of the things that we do is we partner up with an organization called Rhythm Arts Alliance that primarily focuses on West African drumming and culture. And we go into classrooms and work with young people. And one of the first things we teach them is about the griots, right? We teach them about the storytellers of Africa that held on to the stories because they necessarily didn't have a way to write down the stories that would happen. So they would tell these stories over a fire, you know, and share them and pass them down and hand them down generations, right? And there was rhythms, right, that are being used in a lot of music that you hear on the radio. And these rhythms are medicinal. They have have intentions behind them. They have stories behind them. They have, you know, there's a rhythm for when the women would go fishing, you know, for the tribe and bring back the fishes. There's a rhythm for the rituals that would happen when, you know, the young people would get initiated into adulthood. And we teach these young people these things, you know, and knowing when you get to know this history, you can realize, you can hear the rhythms in pop music, in hip hop, that's being used on the radio to sell, to market these things. You know what I'm saying? So when I feel like when you hear a lot of this music that isn't necessarily delivering a message that ties back to that history, it's really it's sad, you know, but it's also understandable when I come across a young person that wants to make music that he hears on the radio, you know. And those are some of the conversations we have, is how do we create music that is meaningful? How do we create music that is medicinal, music that inspires people, music that helps people, that doesn't degrade women, you know? But we have these conversations around all of this, and you'll find a lot of dope, really incredible music that actually tells truth and honesty in that link that I shared. But thank you for asking that question.
Thank you all for those fabulous answers. Our next question is, so incarceration of women is increasing much more rapidly than that of men in prison. Alyesha, could you speak to some of the intersectional issues that are left out of the conversation on mass incarceration? What are some issues that affect women uniquely, and what do folks often forget when thinking about the impact of incarceration on Black and Brown women?
That's a loaded question. Yeah, I think folks forget about a whole lot. Like, first of all, the fact that a lot of our, I'm not even gonna say young ladies, I think young ladies, women are incarcerated due to sex trafficking, due to trying to get away from an abuser, and pretty much punished for someone else's transgressions. I think about trans women and the just overall how they are mistreated behind bars, and how they are put into locked up with men, and just pretty much, sorry, I'm getting emotional, but like brutalized. I've heard like tragic stories. Yeah, I think when it comes, I mean, this is obviously, I'm speaking to young women here and Black and Brown women, but I think this kind of applies across the board with all genders, that a lot of questions aren't asked. Again, a lot of women are punished for their bodies, and the things that, for example, when I was young, one of the things, I just got lucky. I was a lookout girl. And if you don't know what that is, I had to look out and, you know, make sure nothing was happening. And when I say had to, you know, not to go into details, but yeah, I had to. But I could have easily been incarcerated for that without someone asking. So when it comes to these overlapping identities, we have to remember that not only are women punished for a lot of things, just ridiculous things, but when it comes to, when you add the fact that you are Black, you add the fact that you might be a trans person, or you're brown, or you're indigenous, the punishment just piles up and piles up. And I may come back with more, but yeah, that's what I have right now. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. So there are quite a few questions related to terminology. First to Dr. Khan and Dr. Clair. You both mentioned abolishing systems. What is meant by this, and what do you envision evolving next?
Sure, I can start. So abolition is, many people think of it as many things. There are many abolitionists. There isn't a sort of coherent agreement necessarily, but generally, fundamentally, it's sort of a praxis or an invitation or a theory to imagine the world without punitive systems that are racist. So we can think about the abolition movement for slavery. That was imagining a world post-slavery where the slavery as an institution did not exist. We can also think about the contemporary abolition movement, which is geared mostly toward police and prisons, which have clearly historical roots, as Dr. Khan showed, in racism and racialized social control. And so what that means is we need to think about what would the world exist that would make it so that we don't need police and we don't need prisons. And so that's sort of, as Dr. Khan mentioned, to sort of divest from these systems and also invest in systems that would promote social goods, reduce social harm. And so there are very practical ways that this occurs, and there's a path to this that involves what many abolitionists refer to as non-reformist reforms. So these are reforms to the existing system that slowly scale down the system. So we can think of abolishing laws, so decriminalization of drug laws, legalization of drugs. We can also think about slowly reducing prosecutors' offices, having them reduce the numbers and types of criminal charges that they do. We can also think about closing prisons, closing private prisons, public prisons as well. We can think about defunding police departments. And I'll just lastly say, so the abolitionist movement has largely been a Black and brown-led sort of thought movement that sort of emerged around the 90s, the most contemporary form. And it also has sort of historical connections to a movement that emerged in Scandinavian countries in the 60s and 70s, where they were thinking about reducing their prison populations as well. So some of the major works here, if you want to learn more, sort of Angela Lai Davis's work, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Dylan Rodriguez, Dorothy Roberts, and many other people have amazing work theorizing it.
Yeah, I'd recommend reading Angela Davis's Prisons Are Obsolete. I think it sets a very good framework for people to also have these conversations with other people, because I think that's what we need to start doing, right? Like when y'all are talking to your friends, your family, your coworkers, you need to be talking about these things and reading and learning about fundamentally what the history was and why we even want to push towards this specific solution, I think is really important when you get asked questions. And actually Black Lives Matter and the Movement for Black Lives on their website, they have a little Q&A section for folks that want to have these conversations about like what frequent questions do you get asked. And we're going to include that when we send our list of resources out to y'all. So I highly recommend kind of arming yourself with that knowledge. And just like Dr. Clair said, a lot of where the movement evolved from is because of decades and decades and decades of trying these incremental changes for the sake of reform that never worked. And that is a body of research that has looked into what individual reform, like individual reform initiatives or reform as an entire construct has led to in terms of concrete change on the ground. And a perfect example is the Minneapolis Police Department, which did adopt a lot of the laws that people do talk about when it comes to reform, right? Like a ban on chokeholds, the no-knock arrest warrants, and all of those were implemented, and that still led to, you know, George Floyd being murdered in 8 minutes and 46 seconds, right? So it hasn't worked. And I think that's why we begin to think of, if we're going to implement any incremental changes, it has to be with the idea of completely dismantling the system, because it doesn't work for anyone.
Thank you. So we have about 1 or 2 questions left. Our next is, some scholars have talked about how housing segregation perpetuates racial inequality, especially with wealth, taxation, redistribution of funds, which can really impact how much funding is available for local schools. Desegregation is key, but feels almost impossible. Are there any suggestions on how we can actively work to get more funding for schools now, even through desegregation, even though desegregation would be a longer term goal? No takers?
I'll just quickly say, I think this is the type of thing where it's clear that we are diagnosing the problem. We know what the problem is, but it's very hard to, within our existing way that property taxes fund education, think of solutions and legislate solutions. But I will say that one thing, you know, Derek Bell, the prolific legal scholar, really talked about how, you know, post-Brown v. Board of Education, a lot of lawyers were sort of advocating for, we need to desegregate schools, we need to desegregate schools. But a lot of people who were taking cases, or who were those test cases, who were the litigants, really were like, actually, instead of just desegregating schools, I want money and resources for my schools, right? I don't necessarily think desegregation is the principle that I'm going for. I think just having my kids be able to go to a well-resourced school is the principle that I'm going for. And so just, I guess, remembering that part of the diagnosis is not just desegregation is the ultimate end just because that's the principle that we're after, integration. That could be a principle that we're after, but another principle is reminding and focusing on, we could keep these schools 90% Black. We just need resources in these schools, and we need to make sure that our society is investing resources in these schools. And often the path to that is to force white people into them and then realize, upper middle class white people being forced into them realize, oh, actually, maybe there should be resources for the school that my children are going to, which is the unfortunate reality. But maybe there's another path and way, and I don't have a perfect answer.
Thank you. Our next question would be to Art, Taylor, and Alyesha. Pertaining to your work as street poets, how have your approaches of restorative justice changed outcomes for previously incarcerated folks, including youth that they work with? Can we learn from the approach street poets have taken and then apply that same restorative justice model? And what are examples of initiatives you do for ex-incarcerated folks? Should I repeat maybe just the first question?
Yeah, I was waiting to see who was. I was waiting on Alyesha. Ladies first. You know what I'm saying?
No, if you could repeat that, that would be great. If one of y'all want to go first, but I'll answer.
Okay, so the first question is, how have your approaches of restorative justice changed outcomes for previously incarcerated folks, including youth that they work with?
All right, since you guys are waiting for me to go first. So yeah, I mean, one of the things is we see the person, we have conversations. That's lacking. I think I brought that up before. We talk to someone. If someone is quote unquote troubled, we bring them in and try to figure out something. If there is an issue between two individuals, we bring them in and try to figure that out. I think a lot of our meetings, a lot of our processes, a lot of our time spent is spent talking about our community members, those who show up, those who we have yet to meet, but we know that we serve. And also we talk about a lot of people as individuals. It's like this person might be in need of us. And we not just, as far as like someone's going through something, but like how can we, just show up in general for those who may not even know that like we'll be able to like impact them. And so we're all about like seeing the person, we're all about having conversations, and just like anti-punishment. I don't like the word punishment. I'm not a fan of it. I think what Street Poets is doing is really modeling what a lot of activists and what a lot of this movement has been about, which is, can we get rid of punishment and go to restorative processes and start to really see how, I know from experience, when a person is heard and asked again, how are you? Or just said, how can we work through this? You show up more. I think naturally as human beings, when we're just have a finger wagged at us or are punished, we end up kind of like, there's a response to that. There's a physical, spiritual, mental response. And I've seen quite the opposite in the way that we approach our community members.
Yeah, totally. I would definitely have to agree with Alyesha. There's something really therapeutic and empowering about using the art form of poetry to kind of spill your guts and let people kind of know what's going on with you. And it puts us in a situation where we can hold people accountable and challenge them in a different way. Because a lot of the young people I've worked with over the years. So basically, I came through Street Poets as a 16-year-old kid. I'm 41 now, so I got a 25-year history with the organization. And so a lot of the young people and incarcerated people that we work with, they have a lot of traumatic baggage, and that traumatic baggage is what is in most cases is what was the driving force behind these kids turned into a life of crime, looking for acceptance and love from gangs. And so when you take someone who's kind of been through that and experienced that and made those same mistakes as well, but yet you come out the other side of it, it gives you it puts you in a unique position, and I can say, hey, you know what, we're all of us as street poets, who share, some similarities with the people we work with. We can say, hey, you know what, we understand your pain. We understand that it's a real thing, but at the same time, that you can choose to do something different now that now that you know that there are different kinds of options out there, and that you see people like you who have led a similar lifestyle and have, found a way to do something different and create a living and, a different type of legacy for themselves, and really start giving back to the community that way, because for me, there weren't a lot of people who was living the kind of lifestyle that I was living, when I was coming through the Street Poets Workshop. So people who showed up and had a good heart, they didn't necessarily have the street credibility for me to be like, oh, well, you know what I'm saying? Because it's like, oh, dude, you never experienced what it's like for somebody to pop out of a trunk of a car and empty a whole clip on you, or somebody to stick a shotgun through your bedroom window while you're sleeping and try to blow your head, so I wasn't open to, guidance, and that was a fault of my own. But one of the things that I do different in my work is I stress the importance of young people establishing connections and relationships with people who've lived a different background than they have, because that's where all the new information is coming from. If we only talk and associate ourselves with people who've gone through the things that we've gone through, where's the new growth come from? And if you really want to break a cycle, one of the most important factors in breaking a cycle of gang violence and addiction and abuse and things of that nature is new experiences, new friends, through Street Poets, I've been exposed to Native American sweat lodges, coming back to life ceremonies, purification rituals, and things that I would have never experienced, within that 5-mile radius of my block. So yeah, those are just a couple of the ways that, that we can be of service, that we can use what we've learned through Street Poets and our experience to be of service to the community, or ways that if somebody out there that's listening who may want to work with young gang-involved, formerly incarcerated people who may think, well, you know what, I didn't live the life that they lived, so I can't relate to these kids, or I don't have anything to offer. That's not true. You have a lot to offer, and a lot of times you have more to offer than someone who's just been through that situation. You got the new codes, the new cheat code for the video game. But anyway, but yeah, I'll just stop there.
For a lot of the young people that we work with, that idea is a new idea. A lot of them don't have the wisdom or the knowledge around restorative justice. So presenting them with those ideas and having them understand that is important. And we one of the things that we do is take young people out of the concrete jungle and into the wilderness to connect with nature. As Taylor was talking about, we provide those opportunities where young people can connect with, the earth and also get away from their communities for a while. And what you find when you do that is the young people will open up in ways that they won't in the city, because in the city, oftentimes they have to have their mask on, they got to have their guard up. There's not an opportunity for them to be seen for who they truly are in a lot of ways. And so you find that these young people are carrying this trauma, they're carrying these wounds. And as one of our mentors and writers, Michael Mead says, the wounds, the gift and the wound are side by side. We all have wounds, and if we can dive into those wounds and look at those wounds, we can find gold there and gifts that are needed in our community and medicine. And when we take these young people out into the woods and we use story, poetry, drumming, music, we provide opportunities for them to come out of their shells and actually be seen for who they are, and to tell the stories that have never been told. And those go from, you know, young people being abused, to young people being shot at, to being shot, to being wounded, to, you know, not having parents, to all kind of trauma that ends up in this room, and it all comes out, and we all see each other, and then we go into ritual spaces and try to deal with that and work with that. And we talk about restorative justice, and there have been situations where young people that have trouble with each other up there work that out, and actually gang rivals come together in spaces like that where they wouldn't in the city. And so it's an important concept, and it's something that is needed more in our communities, definitely, and more examples of that as well. Examples that we found, we definitely present those. But, you know, even in my own life, where people have harmed me, and I've you know, forgiven them and sat next to them and been like, you know what, I forgive you. It was me trying to be my bigger self in order to be able to see how restorative justice can really work, you know, because I know that it's important and needed. So thank you for that question. It's an important one.
And I'll also like quickly say something that we did for our kids at the camps that we used to tutor at and the juvenile detention facilities is try to let them know that whatever they choose to use as a art form for healing doesn't have to always be something that, you know, talks about their trauma, is about educating the community, because we do so much of that, right? Not just these kids, but we do that, right? And I'm sure people can like associate with this in academia. We're balancing our careers at the same time as we're probably fighting structural racism. Our communities back home are suffering. And so we feel like we have to lead the mantle for racial justice all the time. We're paying the minority tax by constantly taking on all these diversity and inclusion initiatives and leading them and mentoring other younger students of color. It's a lot on our plate, right? And it's also that a lot of that our white peers are not doing that. Right? That they get to focus on their careers. That also means they get to focus on having hobbies, on reading a book, listening to music, all these things that we just don't get to do. So I think we started to teach our students to not feel like they have to do that all the time, right? And that includes making hip hop that sometimes is just about talking about whatever the hell you want to talk about, right? Especially for women, right? I don't want to, you know, discount all of the other, you know, all of the other issues that hip hop talks about, right? Not just social justice and racial justice, but especially if you're talking about empowering female sexuality, it's important, right? Because for so many of us, we don't get an outlet to do that. We don't get a chance to do that. And sometimes constantly rehashing intergenerational trauma and only talking about that over and over again makes it really difficult. It's like picking at a scab, right? Like sometimes you just need to let go and not talk about that. And so we just let them write a poem about the sky if they wanted to do that. It doesn't have to be something that's productive, right? It just has to make them feel good. And ultimately that's because we feel the need to produce information or art all the time that teaches people about racism. But racism is fundamentally a white problem, right? It's created by white supremacists, and white people are ultimately upholding and benefiting from it. So it isn't our problem. We didn't do this, but we're still putting in majority of the labor and the work when it comes to solving it and also raising awareness, right? So I think, yeah, teaching kids and teaching anyone really to be kind with themselves, and it's okay to not want to do it all the time or not want to do it at all because you need to take care of yourself. I think that's fine. I think that's ultimately resilience, right?
Yeah, totally. Thanks for saying that, Ayesha. Totally.
Yes, thank you all for your answers. I wouldn't like to keep y'all much longer, so we just have our final question, and it's open for anybody. Black Americans have been incarcerated through unjust charges, inability to pay bail, and for practices that are now legal. What are your thoughts on decarceration and how we can implement it?
I think honestly, we need more resources to go into, you know, organizations like Street Poets, you know, resources to go into mental health, resources to go into education, resources to be taken from law enforcement or, you know, things that are not working and be put into the community directly, you know, because I know that if I had like a street poets in my day, I probably would have never gotten incarcerated. If I had a mentor, if I had, you know, somebody that was there that could support me, you know, when I was young and didn't have direction and wasn't really being educated in the system. No one really cared. The teachers didn't really care. You know, my parents were always working. You know, things would be different. And I see that in a lot of the young people that we work with. You know, we have kids that are in the foster system. We have young people that have one parent, you know, at home that aren't home because they're working all the time. You know, and when you talk about, you know, the folks that are coming out of the system, you know, as people were saying, they come out with a felony or they come out with a strike or whatever it may be, with a criminal record. It's hard to integrate back into society and to get a job and to, you know, especially in these times where we're living in COVID, you know, and everyone's being asked to stay home and things like that. I mean, it's difficult to get employment and to be able to pay the bills. And so there needs to be resources going into community that can support people, that can help their mental health, that can help them, you know, build a resume, that can help them, you know, process some of the trauma that they've been through. You know, all of these things are so important, and we don't need more policing in our communities. We have enough of that, and we have we have enough police pulling us over and asking us where we're going, and if we have drugs and guns in the car, and you know what I'm saying. A lot of those things can be dealt with in organizations like Street Poets. You know what I'm saying. A lot of those conversations can be had. You know what I mean. And I think that that's where the money needs to be going into right now. The conversations that we're having here are important. How do we fund this? You know what I'm saying? How do we continue having these conversations so we can come up with more solutions? I think this is so important.
And I'll also say that, like Art said, the whole divest invest model, it's fundamentally about giving money to the people that know how to do this, right? Putting money back into the community and giving it to people that are equipped to do this, like the Street Poets, because you're taking money away from harm and directly putting it into the hands of the people that are investing so much of their time and energy into uplifting their communities. But I think even thinking about it as reparations, right? Because I think it's part of the question, but you know, marijuana possession, a lot of folks that are incarcerated right now that are incarcerated for carrying, and not even dealing, right? Carrying and possessing marijuana. And marijuana today in several states, but in general, is a multi-billion-dollar industry run by corporations that are largely run by white people, right? So they are literally profiting from the one thing that I think we can all agree was so decimating to communities of color. And that's one way, right? Besides taking away money from policing and putting it into community initiatives like the Street Poets and mental health and social work, also taking profits away from these corporations and putting them right back into the Black community, because, and you know, like Latino communities and Indigenous communities, because that's exactly what that system of inequity is, right? That you're creating. You're using something that was so painful for folks and then profiting off of it later because it works for you now. And that's really the problem, because we think about the war on drugs, and then we think about everything else after, right? Which was the war on terror, and then now the war on immigration. It's all stuff that's deployed to take people that are vulnerable, that have historically been disenfranchised and marginalized, and then deploy all of these systems to keep them down. And fundamentally, these systems can't work, right? They don't work. They weren't built in the first place to protect and care for these people, right? And I think that's how we should start thinking about this. All of this is part of white supremacy, right? All of this is part of that. And until we, like Art said, take away money to dismantle them, there's really no way for us to be able to move away from it. So I don't want to just think about decarceration as much as just, you know, fundamentally putting money back into the community that deserves it.
I just want to quickly add to what was already said. Yeah, co-signing all that, obviously. And then also, like, we are living in a country that operates largely off of fear a lot. And I think a lot of people don't have enough information about what abolition looks like, what de-incarceration looks like. And obviously you can Google it, you can go attend some sessions and get some information. But unfortunately, we're living in a very, in a country where everything is like, information is just like, what do I see on Instagram or on my Twitter feed versus what am I actively trying to learn? So my point is to try to meet the people where they are. I would love if there was more public information about what that looks like, what decarceration would look like in some way. If we could just, I mean, I know the activists are doing it, putting the info out there, but for all these companies and organizations who claim to support the Black Lives Matter movement and all the movements that are happening, I would really, really love to see more public information about just dismantling this, quote unquote, this, well, it is a system, dismantling the system.
And I just want to add one thing. They should definitely stop housing people for, you know, low-level offenses. Should definitely stop being housed in the county jails. In the because basically the county jail is something that's designed to break you. It's so horrible in there that the circumstances in there are so horrible that people are literally like accepting guilty pleas in order to just get out of there, you know, because the talk is, you know what, man, it's way better in prison. You know, you get fed better, the living conditions are better, and so you don't have money for bail, or you don't have any, you know, good legal representation, and you sitting in there, and you know they put your court date off by, you know, for a couple months. You know, your next court date is 90 days away. And you in here dealing with all the things you deal with in there. So they should basically, it should be illegal to hold people in the county jail systems for, you know, crimes that don't meet certain criteria. You know what I mean? Because that's part of the reason why the district attorneys have such high conviction rates is people so desperate to get out of the county jail that they accepting plea deals that they really shouldn't be accepting. But, you know, just all in their name and trying to get out of there and get back home, you know, as quick as they can, you know, that's what's happening in
there. Okay. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of the attendees who joined us tonight. So please consider donating to our fundraiser so that we may continue to host webinars like this, as well as fund our advocacy initiatives across the Texas Medical Center and beyond. You can visit our GoFundMe page, which will be linked in the chat, or you can Venmo one of our organizers, Srija, whose handle is also found in the chat. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll also be posting our link tree that will have links to additional resources related to this webinar, our points of unity, previous webinar recordings, and direct links to our social media platforms. We'll also be selling t-shirts and potentially masks, the pandemic's hottest fashion accessory. There will be a Google form to fill out your information if you're interested in purchasing one in the future, as well as joining our email list. Again, thank you very much to all of our lovely panelists. We hope to see you again in 2 weeks for our next segment in our anti-racism teach-in series.
Cool. Thanks for having us. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Enjoyed the conversation. Definitely big shout out to Dr. Khan and Dr. Clair. And, you know, you guys definitely, I feel a little smarter after having a conversation with you guys. You know what I'm saying? And it was definitely good seeing my Street Poets folks again, Art and hey, Alyesha, you know, sending the best to everybody, and thank you so much, Miranda, for, you know, moderating and you know, putting it together. I'll definitely be copping one of those masks. Whoever's making the mask right now, making a killing.
Definitely.
I wish I could sew some masks together.
And to everyone still here, we'll send out all the resources like after as well. So everything about the Street Poets, everything that, you know, Taylor's book, Dr. Clair's paper, so y'all can understand some of the background and all the work that's been done.
Yeah, I was gonna say, follow Street Poets, buy Dr. Clair's book. Yeah, great discussion tonight, guys.
All righty, signing off.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Everybody.